In this lecture, we will focus on biomes, and we're really going to focus just on terrestrial biomes. What we see in the background of this slide is a prairie being burned. You can tell it's a prairie, or at least a grassland, because of all of the grass that's growing up here. And you can see this line where the fire has reached. If this prairie wasn't burned, then probably trees like the ones that we see in the very background here would encroach and start to grow within this area. So one thing that we'll talk about is that both climate and biotic influences control what kind of biome occurs in an area. We're going to start by defining biomes and talking a little bit about what they mean, and then we are going to talk about several examples, which we'll go through one at a time. Biomes are assemblages of organisms with similar traits, and those traits are going to relate to the climate or other aspects of the environment. And we could define biomes based on animals or other organisms, but we will almost always define them based on the plant types that occur there. As I said at the introduction, biomes can include aquatic or terrestrial systems, but because most plants are terrestrial, we will focus on terrestrial biomes in this lecture. So biomes are not really about relationships among plants. In an earlier lecture, we talked about phylogenetics or systematics and how plants are related. But when we talk about biomes, we're much more interested in the traits, not where the plants came from in an evolutionary framework. And so we can have different regions around the world that have the same biome type, even if the plants that occur in them are unrelated to one another. This can occur because traits can become similar between different kinds of plants because of convergent evolution. We've already seen examples of this. One that we've already talked about a couple of times this semester is cacti and euphorbs. And I showed you pictures showing you that the cacti that occur in North American deserts look very much like the euphorbs that occur in African deserts, and also like some cactus-like plants that occur in deserts in Australia, even though those plants are actually in the bean family. And so this is a case where we have different unrelated plants showing similar traits. We would say that the desert biome is the same biome in Africa, North America, and Australia, even though those plants are not closely related. Another example of this is evergreen leaves compared to deciduous leaves. So remember, evergreen leaves do not fall off, and deciduous leaves do fall off on a seasonal basis. We'll see that broadleaf evergreen leaves are going to occur anywhere where conditions are warm and moist, while deciduous leaves are going to tend to occur in places where conditions are seasonally cold or dry. Now, this is going to be true even though there are many different kinds of unrelated deciduous trees, and there are many kinds of unrelated evergreen trees. So again, we're defining the biome based on the pattern, not based on a taxonomic group of plants. Now we're going to switch gears and actually talk about some major kinds of biomes. I will give a caveat that this list can be divided up in other ways. Some people split these into several more biomes, and some people combine some of these together into the same biome. And so those choices are fairly arbitrary, but the list we're using here is a fairly conventional way of splitting up terrestrial biomes. So we'll talk about tundra, which occurs up in the Arctic, and then we'll work our way towards warmer areas, and we'll hit boreal forest, which is in cold areas just below the tundra. Then we'll talk about moist temperate forest, which can be either deciduous or evergreen, and that will get us down through, let's say, Canada into North America. and even into the South Carolina region where I am located. We'll talk about scrub or chaparral, which occurs anywhere where we get seasonally dry, hot conditions and mild winters. We'll see that spread out in a few places around the world. And we'll talk about grasslands, which occur in in areas that are hot and dry during the summer, oftentimes cold during the winter, and we'll see that fire and grazing are important to maintaining grasslands. We'll talk about deserts, which actually can occur in hot or cold areas. But the important thing about deserts is that they are always dry areas. And we'll talk about tropical rainforest, which happens to occur in moist areas with very abundant rainfall. Let's start with tundra. Tundra occurs near the poles, but because there's not much land near the South Pole except Antarctica, and Antarctica is largely uninhabited, we're really focusing on the northern tundra here, so especially the North Pole. And in the environment around the North Pole, it's not a surprise that it's cold. It's also extremely windy, partly because there are not trees to stop that wind. And the growing season is extremely short. So remember that around the North Pole, there's going to be a long period of time where there's literally no sunlight. The sun goes down and doesn't come back for weeks or months later. And along with this, the temperatures are going to stay extremely cold for most of the year, and they'll only be above freezing and able to support plant growth for a few weeks a year. Along with this, there's a condition called permafrost, and the name tells you what it means. Perma as in permanent, and frost as in frozen. And so this refers to a depth below the soil surface, below which the ground remains frozen year-round, even during the summer when the temperatures actually get above freezing. So the air might be in the 50 degrees, and the top few centimeters of soil might warm up to above freezing, but everything beneath those top few centimeters of soil stays frozen. And that will have big significance for the kinds of plants that can grow. Surprisingly, there's very little precipitation in the tundra region. That's because the air up here is cold, and cold air tends to be dry. So there's not much rain, there's not even very much snow. Just add that in. However, there's also very little evaporation because it's too cold for evaporation to occur. So that means that even though there's not much addition of water, there's still abundant water. And that water will be frozen for part of the year and may thaw only during the summer. Along with all of these challenging conditions, there's fairly low nutrient levels in the soil. This is because the soil hasn't had substantial opportunity to develop because there's little plant growth and little water moving through the soil. So these are challenging conditions to grow in. The result of this is going to be that the plants we get tend to be small. They tend to be plants that like high moisture conditions. And some examples of this are lichen, and you can see lichen down here. So lichen isn't technically a plant, it's rather a symbiotic association of a fungus and the plant. And I'm pretty sure we've talked about this, but let me just add that in to make sure. And you can see that these can grow in areas with bad soil. In fact, you'll typically find them growing on rocks, which have no soil at all. We also will have mosses and liverworts. As you know from when we talked about both of these lineages, these don't have deep root systems. In fact, they don't have true roots at all, and they require moist conditions in order to survive. There will be grass-like plants. So by that I mean grass itself, and sedges, which are not true grasses, but they are close relatives, and they look very much like grasses. There is some woody vegetation, but it is very stunted. So it might only be centimeters or decimeters tall, 10, 20, or 30 centimeters. But you will never find anything that looks like a large shrub or a tree. And because the above ground tissue is going to be exposed to harsh freezing conditions throughout much of the year, many of the plants that occur in this region will have underground storage structures where they can safely store the nutrients they gather during those few summer months. And we talked about mosses, so here's one of the mosses that grows in the region. This is called a reindeer moss. I assume because it looks like the antlers, not because reindeer eat it. That's my best guess. So we just talked about this northernmost region, the tundra. The next band beneath this is the boreal forest, also called the taiga. And some people treat these terms as synonyms. Some people make a distinction between how far north you are within this band. We're going to just treat these two as synonyms. So this is a cold region with a longer growing season than the tundra. The tundra has only a few weeks. We're now getting into a couple months of growing season for the boreal forest. There's, just like the tundra, there's fairly little precipitation in this band, but like the tundra, it's also cold, meaning that there's not much evaporation. So their water availability tends not to be a problem, at least during the summer. Water availability can be a problem during the winter because obviously this region stays below freezing for long periods of time and frozen water is unavailable to plants. And so water stress can be an issue even though there's actually a fair amount of water that in theory would be available if it was not frozen. The soil tends to be poor and acidic in this region, further making plant growth difficult. The vegetation in the boreal forest is mostly conifers. Of course, all conifers are trees, so just remember that. And the conifers are going to have needle-like leaves. And so you can see that here on the spruce, and you can see that here on the balsam fir. Needle-like leaves are useful in this environment. First, the leaves are evergreen, so they're kept on the tree year after year, and this helps the tree retain nutrients that are important because it cannot easily replace those nutrients because the soil is of low quality. And conifer leaves like this have adaptations to help reduce water loss. Looks like there's a spelling problem here. For example, they have thick cuticles, which we've talked about as a way of preventing water loss. They also have some other adaptations like having sunken stomata that reduce the evaporation from the surface of the leaf. And so this is going to help the plants get through those winter months when the water in the soil is frozen and it can't replenish water that gets lost from the leaves. I mentioned spruce and fir here. There are also pines within the boreal forest region. We're going to continue moving south. This doesn't extend the whole way across North America. We'll see there's grasslands and other forest types that intervene. But it occurs in eastern North America as well as other parts of Europe and Asia. So this is temperate forest, which occurs in relatively warmer and more moderate climates than the boreal forest. We now have an extended growing season where there is at least 4 months without frost, and there could be up to 6 months or more without any frost. And so this is going to give the plants more opportunity to grow. In the boreal forest, depending on where we are, these trees could be growing anywhere from as little as a couple of centimeters per year, extremely slowly for some species. In the temperate forest, because we've got this longer growing season, we've got warmer conditions that will both lead to more growth. We also have moderate precipitation, so there tends to be enough water available, typically during the growing season. And finally, we have fertile soil. And so the plants really have everything they need to have a reasonably high growth rate. So the temperate forest is dominated by large, tall trees. And this isn't a surprise if you've gone hiking in established forest. There's varied vegetation types depending on rainfall and soil. And so this is where some people start defining several other kinds of biomes, and some people keep it all under temperate forest. Generally speaking, deciduous trees, those who lose their leaves in the winter, are going to dominate in areas where the temperature is relatively warm and there's adequate soil moisture and adequate nutrients. The leaves will fall off when it gets cold out. So it doesn't need to be warm year-round, but at least it's going to be relatively warm during parts of the year. And within the temperate forest, in addition to the large tall trees that dominate, there is also opportunities for smaller trees as well as shrubs and a ground layer to occur. So the ground layer could be woody vegetation at ground level. It could also be herbs that don't make true wood and grow near the ground. And the shrubs and ground layer can occur, at least in part, because during the fall and especially during the springtime, when the large trees have lost their leaves, that then gives an opportunity for sunlight to reach down to the ground level and allow plants down there to photosynthesize. Once the canopy closes and leaves get made in the springtime, then much less light reaches the ground level, and it's harder for plants under the canopy to get enough sunlight to survive and grow. So that window before the leaves fill in is really important for this ground layer. We just described where temperate deciduous forest would grow. Now let's think about where temperate evergreen forest would grow. And if you remember, deciduous forest was growing here, as well as in much of Europe and a little bit of Asia. You can see that evergreen temperate forest has a different distribution, especially along the west coast and the southeast of the United States and North America. So where will this grow instead? Conifers are going to tend to dominate where it is colder, such as up here, or when there's lower moisture availability or lower nutrient availability, which is true in the southeast of the United States, down here. And we'll talk about why that is. When we're talking about temperate evergreens, we're mostly talking about pines or other kinds of conifers. And we're going to focus now on what happens in the southeast of the United States, because that's the region where most of you are. And in this region, first, let's think about what the forest is like. This would be like on the coastal plain of South Carolina, especially. We will tend to have open forest with a lot of space between the trees. And you can see that really well in this photograph. You can see there's a lot of ground cover. Ground cover is able to grow because there's such large openings that lots of light is getting down to ground level. And why is it that we are getting so many openings in this ecosystem? It turns out that the soil on the coastal plain is quite sandy. And because it's sandy, water that, when it does rain, and actually this region gets a reasonable amount of rain, but as soon as it rains, that water percolates right through the soil and is no longer available to the plants. So the plants experience a dry environment despite the precipitation. Additionally, the soil is not especially high nutrients, and so there's two stressors here, the lack of water and lack of nutrients in the soil. That explains then why the trees don't grow more densely, just because conditions aren't very good. Now, an additional factor that's important in the southeastern evergreen forests is that these tend to be fire-dependent ecosystems. And this is especially true for longleaf pine, which is now fairly rare, but would have been what dominated this region, shown in green, prior to Western colonization. And so longleaf pine really requires wildfire to be able to regenerate. Wildfire does a couple of things. First, it removes competitors like oaks that would also like to live here. And second, it is going to help seeds germinate from the pines and help the seedlings establish. Longleaf pine itself is typically not killed by fire. And so if a fire comes through, competitors are killed, but the pine is then able to grow in the competition-free environment after the fire passes. Now, this is important from our perspective as managers. If we want to maintain a longleaf pine forest, then we have to consider whether fire suppression is in our interest. If we do suppress fires, then oaks will move in and longleaf pine will tend not to regenerate. The result is that our longleaf pine forests will get replaced by oak forests, which are nice, but aren't what we've had in this area. And that has all sorts of effects for other things like red-cockaded woodpeckers and other wildlife that are dependent on having longleaf pine ecosystems. The next region that we will consider is the scrub or chaparral. This is a biome that occurs wherever we have a Mediterranean type climate. And by Mediterranean climate, we're referring to cool, wet winters and hot, dry summers. And this combination is challenging for plants because the lack of water in the summer really limits growth. Additionally, like the longleaf pines, this ecosystem is going to be very prone to fire. And so plants growing in it need ways to survive. The chaparral or scrub ecosystem is going to be dominated by shrubs. So smaller than trees, and again, kind of like the longleaf pine, it's not going to be a closed canopy. You can see, in fact, in this picture, there's a lot of open space between the shrubs. Some characteristics of the shrubs. They will often have roots that extend very deep into the soil, trying to reach the water table. This would give them access to water during the summer, even when they are in drought conditions. They will also make roots that are shallow, such that if it does rain, they will have a better chance of being able to acquire that water. Now, leaves in the scrub can either be deciduous or evergreen, but if they're evergreen, then they are going to have mechanisms for drought resistance, similar to what we talked about with the conifers. And as we mentioned, there's space between the shrubs. This is going to allow ground cover to grow. You can see what looks like grass growing in this photograph here. Now, when fires do come through, then this is going to kill much of the plant material that's growing above ground. However, it also does a couple of things to help. So most of the shrubs that will grow in this ecosystem are fire adapted, and they will resprout from their roots once their stems have been killed, and they can regrow from there. Also, the herbs that are growing between the shrubs will have the opportunity to grow either from seed or from rhizomes or bulbs after fire, and take advantage of the nutrients that are released and the lack of competition. And so fire, while it does destroy the above ground biomass, has a net positive for the biome. We will move on to grasslands, and we're sort of moving in the direction of drier environments. So we said that chaparral was dry over the summer. Grasslands are going to tend to also occur in dry areas, and especially areas that have cold winters and hot summers for temperate grasslands, ones like in the American Midwest. So dry, cold winters, hot summers. And like the last couple of biomes we've mentioned, these are going to be maintained partly by fire. I showed you in this first slide a managed fire. This was probably started by somebody intentionally walking along here to help maintain the prairie ecosystem. By burning, a lot of the shrubs or trees that would grow in are going to get killed. The grass will generally not get killed because even though everything above ground has been killed, it will have its meristems just beneath the surface and will be able to regrow again. So fire is important to maintaining grasslands, but there's something else that's also important, and that is grazing. So grasslands tend to have large mammals, and large mammals that are browsers and are eating grass and other herbs. This is important because when those grazers come through, they will likely eat seedlings that could grow into being shrubs or trees, and so they will prevent them from establishing. However, when a grazer eats grass, because grass keeps its meristems down near the soil surface, the grazer won't typically eat the meristem. The result is that the grass can just grow back. It doesn't have to grow back from seed if it's eaten. And so when we have grazers, things like buffalo, for example, then we can maintain grasslands. But when we lose those grazers, then we have the potential of losing the grasslands and having forest move in instead. So eastern prairie, like would occur in Ohio or Illinois, or even into Iowa, will fairly quickly, within 10 or 20 years, start to revert to forest if we remove grazers, and especially if we do that and stop burning the area to keep out the shrubs. Now, obviously, grasslands are dominated by grass, hence the name, and we've just talked about this, that the meristems are at ground level to survive grazing. But grasslands have not only grass, they also have a very diverse herb community. It's one of the richest places for wildflowers, for example, in North America. So we do have herbs co-occurring with the grass. Moving even further into the direction of dry biomes, we'll talk about desert. Desert is defined by its dryness. Rainfall is less than 25 centimeters a year. That's a quarter meter, or about a foot. And so that's really a very small amount. Temperatures can vary. We're used to thinking of deserts as being hot, but there are both hot deserts and cold deserts. Antarctica would classify as a cold desert, for example, because it gets less than 25 centimeters of rain or other precipitation. I'm going to change rainfall and be a little bit more accurate and say precipitation, because even with snow, Antarctica still gets less than 25 centimeters per year. Because there's so little rain, and because there's so little plant material, there's very little soil development in deserts. So remember that plants help soil develop by both releasing acids from their roots, from dropping litter that can decay, and some other mechanisms. And then water itself helps to build soil by moving plant matter down into the soil and moving nutrients through the soil. So when we don't have either of these things, then the soil doesn't develop. What soil does develop can be lost to erosion. So when it does rain, there's not a lot of plants to hold the soil in place, and it can get washed away. Additionally, wind can blow the soil away. So there's, again, very little soil. The result of these very challenging conditions is that there's typically a lot of space between plants in the desert. So some conditions, or rather some adaptations plants have for surviving in deserts. Some of these we've talked about before. I know we've mentioned thick cuticles many times. Desert plants tend to be succulent, so they tend to store a lot of moisture within their stems. They tend not to have large leaves, as we've seen especially with cacti. They have modifications that we haven't talked about in depth, like C4 and CAM. And both C4 and CAM are modifications of photosynthesis. They are not different processes. They are some additional steps added to the start of the chemical reactions in photosynthesis, and they have the effect of allowing the plants to conserve water. And because desert plants really need to maintain the nutrients that they've acquired, those nutrients are very expensive to replace. As a result, desert plants are more interested in defending themselves against herbivores than are other plants that have better growing condition. So an obvious example of this is needles on cacti. But there's also chemical defenses. So the plants can make toxic chemicals to keep herbivores away. And you all know about cacti, of course, growing in deserts. So I put over here instead a picture of a Joshua tree, which is related to agave, or it's basically related to lilies. And you can see that even though it's a lily relative, it's taken on a tree-like growth form. And this occurs in deserts in Western North America. And the last biome that we have to talk about is tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest occurs in areas with high humidity and abundant rainfall. We're talking at least 2 meters per year. So we said for a desert, less than 1/4 meter. This is then, more than 8 times as much as a desert. And this can get up to 6 or possibly more meters. So really substantial amount of rain, but also high humidity. So even when it's not raining, not a lot of water will be lost to evaporation because the air is already near saturation for water. The soil in rainforest is not very nutrient rich. This is partly because rain is constantly percolating through, and that would be a good thing because it would help release nutrients. But when there's a ton of rain, then those nutrients that get released also get washed away. In addition, there's a thick canopy layer. So rainforest is dominated by trees. It looks like a forest. And the trees tend to have large leaves, and they capture most of the light. What that means is that down at ground level, it's fairly dark. Because it's dark, it's hard for plants down there to photosynthesize. And so there's a lot of open space at ground level. It's easy to walk through a rainforest. There we go. So the vegetation in rainforests. There's large evergreen trees that do not need to lose their leaves because there's no dry period and there's no cold period. So these are evergreen, but they're angiosperms. They are not conifers typically. Those are dominant. In addition to those large trees, there's many epiphytes. Epi means on and phyte means plant. So epiphytes are plants that grow on the branches of other trees. And here's a picture. These are all, it's hard to tell here, but these are all growing up on the trunk or branch of a tree. And you can see there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 different kinds of epiphytes all growing up here. And they're growing up here because it's a strategy to reach sunlight. We already said that not much light makes it down to the forest floor. So if they can find a way to hitch a ride up, then they have a better chance of intercepting some of the light. For similar reasons, there are many vines that grow in rainforests. It's hard to do the initial growth to get up to the canopy, but once a vine has succeeded in that, it can grow in a high light environment. The last thing I'll add here about rainforests is that they are extremely diverse. So there are many, many species, many more than in temperate forest or taiga or any other biome that we've talked about. And so this is one reason that conservationists are especially worried about protecting rainforests. If a goal is to preserve as many species as possible, then it's much more efficient to do so in the rainforest than it would be in South Carolina or in other temperate areas. So some final thoughts for today's lecture. First, there are many more subcategories of biomes than the ones we've talked about here. Your book does a reasonable job of talking about some of the other subcategories, especially when you're thinking of temperate forest categories. And so you can read more about that in your book. Second, keep in mind that for all of the biomes we've talked about, the primary drivers of what makes that biome occur in an area instead of some other one are temperature and precipitation. But those aren't the only important things. We also saw examples where fire was important. We saw that a few times. And with grasslands, we talked about the importance of grazing. And finally, think about, for all of the biomes we've talked about, how do the traits of the plants in that biome reflect the conditions, and why are the traits the plant has better than other possible traits you could think of?